Good morning, students. Today we will continue with the development of the cardiovascular system. So in part 2, before that I want to tell you that we finished the previous lecture at this stage. So with the folding of the embryo, this pericardial cavity and heart tube is lying ventral to the foregut, you can see in the diagram, and it is caudal to the cranial to the septum transversum. Now, if we see the relation of the heart tube and pericardial cavity, the heart tube is lying in the roof of pericardial cavity with the rotation, because around 180 degree the rotation it happens which move the heart tube in the roof of pericardial cavity. Now, how the adult heart is formed, how the you can see the structure of the adult heart is developed. So in this we can discuss the different events which are happening with heart tube and pericardial cavity. So as the development progress, sacculated heart tube, particularly bulbous cordis and primitive ventricle grows rapidly in a limited space dorsal to the pericardial cavity. Now this heart tube is for some time remain suspended from the dorsal wall of the pericardial cavity. You can see here. See, it remains in the dorsal wall of the pericardial cavity. So here, by two layers of pericardium that forms the dorsal mesocardium. Since the arterial and venous ends of the heart tube are fixed, you can see, and it gradually invaginates into the pericardial cavity in a U-shaped manner, which is called as bulboventricular loop or cardiac loop. In diagram C, you can see here. So this is bulboventricular groove. This cardiac loop mainly involves the bulbous cordis forming sphenic limb of the loop and primitive ventricle forming the caudal limb of the loop. Initially, it is suspended from the dorsal wall by the pericardial sac by a mesentery called as dorsal mesocardium. In diagram A, you can see the dorsal mesocardium. But the central part of this mesentery soon degenerates, forming the communication between the right and left side of pericardial cavity. In diagram B, you can appreciate this thing. So which later on forms the transverse pericardial sinus. As this sinus is formed, the bulboventricular loop lies free in the pericardial cavity, but primitive atrium and sinus venosus lies outside the pericardial cavity embedded in septum transversum. So till then the bulbar and ventricular portion, ventricular portion is lying within the pericardial sac. So what happened later on, the bulboventricular sulcus, which is present between these two structures forming the U-shaped loop, so that disappears and bulbous cordis and primitive ventricle together form a common chamber. You can see in the diagram slowly and slowly the fusion is happening here, and it is a single chamber is formed. Now, as the primitive atrium and sinus venosus get free from septum transversum, they enter in the pericardial cavity and occupy the posterior and superior position to the ventricle. So the position it becomes posterior superior to the ventricle. The heart tube now becomes S-shaped. Now you can appreciate in diagram A, initially the heart tube which was U-shaped because of the appearance of bulboventricular sulcus, now it becomes S-shaped with the entry of atria and sinus venosus as well as the arterial end of that portion. Now the bulboventricular sulcus disappearance and the movement of the atrium and the sinus venosus within the pericardial cavity. So later on that event is followed by the further growth of these structures. With this, what is happening? The atrial chamber that lies behind and above the truncus arteriosus. In diagram C, you can see that is lying behind and above the truncus arteriosus expands. As it does so, definitely, so part of it come to project forwards on either side of the truncus arteriosus, which is known as auricle. In diagram D, you can see the dotted structure that is right and left atrium. Part of that which is projecting beyond the truncus arteriosus is given the name auricle. Now this is the event you can see in a diagram. Initially the heart tube is suspended from the pericardium, dorsal wall of the pericardium through dorsal mesocardium. So a gap appears forming the transverse pericardial sinus. The movement of the atrium and sinus venosus within the pericardial cavity changes the U-shaped structure of this portion into S-shaped bulboventricular loop. So these are the events which are happening. This is just the repetition what we have discussed. Now coming to this is accusation with the movement of the atria coming posterior superior to the truncus arteriosus. With growth, what is happening? Projected portion is seen on either side of truncus arteriosus, and that is given the name auricle. Now, as the movement is happening, the movement of atrium, sinus venosus, the you can say appearance of sulcus. So these movement, the movement of the heart, if it happen in a reverse direction, so that condition is given the name dextrocardia, leading on to that condition, which is known as dextrocardia. All the chambers and associated blood vessels are reversed as a mirror image. Reason is that is heart tubes, they bend to the left instead of right. So basically what is this? All the structure that normally lies on the right side area are on the left side. So that is dextrocardia. It may be associated with another condition, that is situs inversus. So dextrocardia is most of the time it is the part of situs inversus. In situs inversus, what is happening? The organs which are normally lying on one side, they just appear on another side. For example, stomach is on left side of the body, but in situs inversus it will lie on the right side. Same story is with the liver. Liver is on the right side, but it come and lie on the left side in situs inversus. So this is the shape of dextrocardia heart, you can see. So in this, the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, which are normally on the right side, they come and lie on the you can see on this left side, and the arch of aorta, which is just bending and continuing with the descending aorta on the left side, that is lying in the right side in dextrocardia. So this is the condition. Now development of various chambers of the heart. Now we know the heart tube, we know the different parts of the heart tube, but in adult heart we know that there are 4 chambers. So all the chambers, they are separated from each other with the different septi. So how these chambers are formed and what are the different septi which are contributing to that separation? So atrioventricular means the atria and ventricle, they are separated by AV septum. Atrial chamber is separated by interatrial septum. Ventricular chamber is separated by interventricular septum. And interatrial and interventricular septi, they are basically dividing the whole of the heart into 2 portions, right and left heart. And AV septum is just separating the atria, both the atria from both the ventricles. Then aortic pulmonary septum is that septum which is appearing in the truncus arteriosus, and this septum divides the truncus arteriosus to 2 major vessels, that is aorta and pulmonary trunk. So these are the basically ultimate fate. Now first is between the sinus venosus and atria, there is a broad communication is there. That broad communication is horizontally placed, that is transversely, it is oval, you can say horizontally. You can see in the diagram A. So in this diagram, you can see it is transversely placed and oval structure. But as the growth is happening, the fusion, it starts from the left side, and this communication come and lie on the right side only. In diagram C, you can see it is vertically oval now. The communication which was horizontally oval in diagram A. So in diagram C, you can see it is now vertically oval. Now this is known as the sinoatrial communication, and this is guarded by 2 valves, that is right and left venous valves, and these valves meet superiorly to form the septum spurium, and that septum spurium is attached to the wall of the atria that is present on the right side in the atrial chamber. Now coming to the septum which is dividing the atrium and ventricle. Between the atria and ventricle, the communication is initially rounded, that is we call it as AV canal. Later on this canal become transverse. So what is happening next to it, there is proliferation of the cells is happening as the dorsal and ventral cushions, they appear in the dorsal and ventral wall of this communication, and these appearance of these elevations, they just move towards the center and they fuse with each other. So these cushions, they fuse with each other, and now they are known as right and left atrioventricular orifice. So they divide the orifice into 2 portions. The communication which was broad initially, so that is you can say a septum. It appears in the form of cushions which divide this communication into two parts, and we call them orifices. So later on the different valves they develop in this. On the right side and left side tricuspid and bicuspid valves are there, but they just divide the door, you can say door between atrium and ventricle, that is divided into two parts by the cushions which are appearing on the dorsal and ventral wall. Now coming to the interatrial septum. So this interatrial septum discussion is very important. So you should know it. The description is very important and interesting. So as the atrial chambers, they communicate posteriorly with the sinus venosus. We have discussed the orientation of the heart, that atria and sinus venosus, they come and lie on the posterior side of the truncus arteriosus and developing ventricle, the ventricular cavity which is fused. So they come and lie on the posterior side. So they are communicating with the sinus venosus posteriorly, that is clear now, and anteroinferiorly with the ventricle through the AV canal. Now it is divided into, this atrium is divided into two halves by two septi, that is septum primum and septum secundum. Now this septum primum starts developing from the roof of the primitive atrial chamber a little to the left of opening of sinus venosus. You can see in the diagram from the roof of that atrial chamber. So one septum is coming downward, which is given the name septum primum. The growth is happening downward towards the septum intermedium. Then the gap between the septum primum and intermedium is called as foramen primum. You can see in the diagram. So this is foramen primum. So when the proliferation or the growth of the septum primum is happening, so this communication is given the name septum primum. As the growth it proceeds further, so it come and detach from the superior side and is attached to the septum intermedium inferiorly. So definitely there is a communication in the upper portion now. Simultaneously another septum appear on the right side of this septum primum, on left side of this you can say septum spurium. Another septum appear which is known as the septum secundum, which is growing downward, and now this foramen is known as foramen secundum. Now this foramen secundum is a gap between right and left part. Once the septum primum is detached from the superior side and is fused with the septum intermedium downward. Now what is happening next to it? As I have told you, the septum secundum is appearing on the superior side. The lower part of the septum secundum, it is a dilated portion which is given the name crista dividens. So this is crista dividens. Now septum secundum, as it is growing towards the septum intermedium, it overlaps, you can see, it overlaps the foramen secundum. The right and left atria now communicate with each other through an oblique valvular opening between upper margin of the septum primum and lower margin of the septum secundum. Now this passage is now called as foramen ovale. In diagram D you can see an oblique communication between right and left chambers of the atrium. So you can see oblique passage is there which is given the name foramen ovale. Now the edge of the septum secundum, which is given the name crista dividens, is thick and firm. In contrast, the edge of the septum primum that forms the lower boundary of the foramen secundum is thin and mobile like a flap. So when blood flows from right to left, thin flaps, it moves away. There is no obstruction to the blood flow. Because it is very thin, it can move easily. However, when there is tendency for blood to move from left to right, this flap comes in apposition with the septum secundum. Now this septum secundum is quite thick in the lower portion, so and quite firm, so and closes the opening. With this, the closure of the opening it happens. Now the foramen ovale persists throughout the life. After birth, left atrium begins to receive the blood from the lung. Then pressure within this chamber it increases. It is more than that pressure which is lying in the right atrium. This causes the closure of the foramen ovale, which is soon permanently obliterated by fusion of two flaps. So once the pressure on this side it happens, so that the movement of the flap is happening, the fusion between the septum primum and septum secundum it happens. So in adult anatomy, if we see in the right atrium, so this primum persists as fossa ovalis, and a ridge which is present above the fossa ovalis, which is called as the annulus ovalis, that is the remnant of septum secundum. So this is the development of interatrial septum. This is very important. So this is the again a single diagram showing this. You can see the septum secundum, septum primum, then you can say the foramen secundum or ostium secundum. So you can see the picture. Then these are the venous valve, then septum primum is there, then formation of foramen ovale. So between foramen secundum and foramen ovale, the difference is, so this is foramen ovale, it is an oblique passage. When the overlapping of these two septa happens, oblique passage is formed. We just give the name to foramen secundum as foramen ovale at that moment. So definitely the different structures are formed during the development of interatrial septum. Accordingly, if any arrest is happening during its growth, so that defect is given the name accordingly. Then ostium primum defect, ostium secundum defect, patent foramen ovale, premature closure of the foramen ovale. So these are the interatrial septal defects you can see in the diagram. So you can see in the diagram A, there is normal septum formation is there. Then you can see the excessive resorption of the septum primum. So that is the septum primum defect. Then you can see large foramen ovale is there, that is communication persists between right and left atrium. So mixing of the blood, it happens. So you can see the absence of septum secundum. Sometimes the septum secundum is not there. Then these are the different atrial septal defects which can happen. Then absence of septum primum and septum secundum. So these are the defects which are related with the growth of the interatrial septum. So I hope you understand this video. So if you like the video, kindly like it, share it and subscribe it. Thank you very much.